Hi, everybody, and welcome to Big Joe's Journal. My name is Joe Tilden, and I am the host of this program. Well, July 7th, which is tomorrow, as we're taping this program on the 6th, will be the 243rd anniversary of the Battle of Hubbardton. And of course, the Battle of Hubbardton was, I won't say it was a minor skirmish, but it was sort of the skirmishes leading up to the Battle of Saratoga, which was regarded as a turning point of the American Revolution. The British had put together a plan of cutting off New England from the rest of the colonies. And this was going to be a three-pronged approach. General Burgoyne would come down from Canada with a force of about 80,000 men, which would be British regulars, mercenaries, Hessian troops from Germany, and some of their Native American allies. Another general would come in from Toronto, in other words, cut across New York State, and General Howe was supposed to come up from New York City. And they would connect around the Albany area, and the idea was, the British plan was, that they would cut off the New England states, plus the independent nation of Vermont, and sort of take the head off the American Revolution. And they felt with that maneuver, once they had that, it would be a matter of time, picking up the other colonies. Well, at that time, of course, the colonies back in 1775, 2 years earlier, under Ethan Allen, had captured Fort Ticonderoga from a very small British force. The colonists also had a fort in Orwell, Vermont, and what was then known as Rattlesnake Mountain. And that area, of course, West Haven and all that area, as you know, is still manifested with a large population of rattlesnakes. They seem to be concentrated in there, and some of them, of course, are out, as you know, on the west side of Lake Bombazine and so forth. They seem to thrive living in the rubble of the slate quarries for whatever reason. The fortification was right across from Fort Ticonderoga, and it was called Fort Independence, and that mountain is now known as Mount Independence. And the idea of the colonists was, if they maintained Fort Ti and Mount Independence, they could probably stop the British advance down Lake Champlain. Well, let's kick back a little bit. Back in 1775, shortly after taking Fort Ti, a small Continental force under General Montgomery, accompanied by Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys, and another group of Vermonters known as Rogers Rangers, decided to invade Canada, to invade Quebec. Quebec had been the province of France before the French and Indian War, and of course, with the end of that war, it became part of the British Empire. So their feeling was that there was a lot of discontent with the British. And this small force decided to capitalize on it, feeling if they went north, captured Montreal, they would give the colonists a one-up on what many felt was going to be an upcoming armed conflict. Well, in the course of that, they were defeated. A local French general who had served with the French against the British in the previous war was now on the other side. His name was Iberville. And those of you that have gone to Montreal, as you know, there's a small town on Route 7. As you're going up Route 7 to Montreal, it's the town of Iberville, or I guess you call it the community of Iberville. It's not very big. But you go into Iberville and you have a left turn, and then 7 proceeds on north up to the Jacques-Cartier Bridge to get into Montreal. Well, Iberville leading a force of, we would say, I guess now Canadian regulars and a few British troops, was able to defeat Montgomery and Ethan Allen, and also a force of Rogers Rangers. And in that particular thing, Montgomery was killed, and Ethan Allen became a prisoner of war. So Ethan Allen spent the majority of the Revolutionary War not fighting in that war, but he was transported to England. And from England, he was paroled to Ireland. And of course, the word is that there are a number of people in Ireland today that sort of claim descendancy from Ethan Allen during his short stay there as a paroled prisoner of war. Toward the end of the war, he was re-arrested by the British, put on a prison ship, brought over to New York, and was, in an exchange of prisoners, was bargained off. But as far as the rest of the American Revolution, the only part that he had in it, really, was before it actually started. That was capturing Fort Ty and the ill-fated invasion into the province of Quebec. Well, this British plan to cut off New England and his three-pronged approach, the most effective was coming down Lake Champlain. General Burgoyne with 80,000 troops. At Mount Independence and Fort Ty, General St. Clair was the American commander there. And he had reports of this massive British fleet coming down Lake Champlain. Benedict Arnold, who could have been a great American hero if he hadn't been a traitor, was leading a small fleet of ships. Most of them were based out of Basin Harbor, which is now a recreation area up in Ferrisburg. And they were harassing the British fleet coming down Lake Champlain. In other words, causing them delays. But St. Clair realized, well, he only had 4,000 troops. And he wondered about the advisability of making a stand. Well, Burgoyne, as he came down Champlain, devised another plan where he landed some troops on the west side of Champlain, some other troops, mainly Hessians, on the east side. And they marched overland with the fleet coming down the center. The British on the west side of Champlain were able to take a stand in what was known as Mount Defiance, which overshadowed Fort Ty. And once they got there and got their cannon set up, they were able to start bombarding Fort Ty. The result was that St. Clair realized the futility of holding Fort Ticonderoga. So the Americans deserted Fort Ty, came back over to Mount Independence with the massive British military massing against them. St. Clair realized that with 4,000 troops, there was no way he was going to be able to hold off this massive British invasion. So the result was that the American army abandoned Mount Independence. There's no battle fought there. They abandoned Mount Independence, and they retreated. Some retreated down what would now be, well, the first retreat was over into Hubbardton. And as they retreated along that road, Burgoyne sent his Hessian allies to pursue them with a few British regulars. And the Americans retreated, and they finally decided to make their stand in what we now know as the Battle of Hubbardton. Well, General St. Clair felt that there was no way he was going to be able to stop this British advance. So he took along a large segment of the American army, and he retreated down into what is now Castleton. And there he would regroup. And from there he would head further south, going down into Bennington. The troops that were left at Hubbardton were under the command of the man who had succeeded Ethan Allen as the head of the Green Mountain Boys, Seth Warner. And the other members of the Continental Army were under the command of St. Clair's deputy, a man named Colonel Francis. And so they made their stand at what is now known as the Hubbardton battlefield. Well, When the British came on, they didn't come on silently. They had a military band and bagpipes and everything else as they marched into Hubbardton. And there the Americans decided to make their stand. They got behind a stone wall by a small brook, and they made their first stand. And they slowed down the British advance. And then Colonel Francis decided on a counter move. As he spread out the American lines, we'll call them Americans, the American lines, he decided to make a counter move and swing around the north end and try to catch the British from behind. Well, unbeknown to him, there was a second group of Hessians that were coming in. And as he made that move, and he was successful at it, and when he thought he had completed that move and had outflanked the British, lo and behold, up from behind, again, a loud racket of bagpipes and everything else, a large army of Hessians. And of course, this maneuver failed. Colonel Francis was killed. So it left the command of what was left of the American army in the hands of Seth Warner. And realizing that their numbers were down and that they were losing, they decided to beat what we call a strategic retreat. And they withdrew. And the amazing thing is, they thought they might be able to withdraw down to Castleton. But the British had foreseen this move, and they cut off that route. That's now the road going from Castleton up to the Hubbardton battlefield. The British cut that off. So cut off from the north, the west, the south. The only alternative was to go directly east, up over those mountain ridges, across that swampland, and try to make it over to a fort in Pittsford. Right now, the monument to that fort is on the town line between Pittsford and Brandon. And I believe that was called Fort, I think the name was Fort Defiance or Fort Resistance. I can't remember which one. But that was their goal, and under South Warner. The Americans, taking their wounded and as many of their dead as they could, fought that strategic retreat for somehow or another. And if you go over there today and you look at the area, you have to say, how in hell did they do it? But they very successfully made it over there. They made it back to Pittsford. And once they had reconnoitered in Pittsford, they decided, or Seth Warner, I guess their commander, decided that the point of trying to hold that, because they felt there was going to be future British advances, and at the request of General St. Clair, who was in Castleton and was already headed south to Bennington, that they head down Route 7 and they go into Bennington. Now at Bennington, the Americans had a large store of weapons and a large collection of horses and a large collection of supplies. And at Bennington, they would reconnoiter with a group of militia from New Hampshire and Massachusetts under the command of John Stark. And this retreat down through Rutland, Wallingford, Manchester, Arlington, into Bennington, very little action, pretty much successful. The American Army, when they reached Pittsford, they were exhausted. And while General St. Clair wanted them to come immediately and proceed to Bennington, Seth Warner decided that his men were too tired for the march. And so he stayed there for a day or two and let them sleep and rest and so forth. And after a couple of days, they joined the rest of the group, headed south, headed to Bennington. Well, Burgoyne, in the meantime, he had Fort Ty, he had Mount Independence, he had Hubbardton, and the people he had sent into Hubbardton, of course, rejoined him at Fort Ty, and they continued the advance on to Skenesboro, which is now Whitehall. Benedict Arnold, in the meantime, with his small fleet, had made it into Skenesboro. Incidentally, of course, as you know, Whitehall is one of the many places that claims to be the birthplace of the United States Navy. And that is due to the fact that Benedict Arnold, when he built his first fleet to sail up Lake Champlain to harass the British advance. That's where he started from. And Whitehall uses that as their claim to being the birthplace of the United States Navy. But Burgoyne marched into Skenesboro, and then he continued south. He captured Fort Anne, captured Fort Edward. But along the way, he was meeting some minor harassment. Militiamen were cutting down trees to slow down the advance of their cavalry and so forth. And he was also running low on supplies. So when he arrives at Saratoga, and he is assuming that his other two British allies, one is coming in from the west and one coming up from the south, he assumed they were coming. You know, they didn't have modern communications in those days. Well, unbeknown to Burgoyne, the advance coming from Toronto had been stopped in the middle of New York. They'd been dealt a devastating defeat by New York State militia and had retreated back into Canada. From the Southern Vision, General Howe never left New York City. He stayed where he was. So Burgoyne is out there at Saratoga, and he doesn't have that help coming to him, and he needs supplies. Well, he finds out from his Native American allies that the colonists, or the Americans, have a huge store of supplies in what is now Bennington. And so he decides to send his Hessian mercenaries down to capture Bennington, bring the horses, bring supplies, bring food back to his troops. And they would rest at Saratoga and then continue the advance on and capture Albany, assuming that he assumed that his two allies would meet him there. Well, the Hessians headed south, and Colonel Stark rallied the militias of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, the Green Mountain Boys of Vermont under Seth Warner. And I said, well, rather than wait for the Hessians to come into Bennington, why don't we go out and meet them? And of course, the first meeting took place at Hoosick Falls, New York. Their militia from New Hampshire and Massachusetts were the first to encounter the Hessians. Seth Warner, coming in with his Green Mountain Boys, made a military maneuver, swung around behind the Hessians and cut them off, cut off their supply line. So you had the Hessians caught in the middle between the New Hampshire and Massachusetts militia on the south, the Green Mountain Boys on the north. They had nowhere to go. And the result was a victory. I guess you could call it a big victory at that time for the Americans at Hoosick Falls, what we call today the Battle of Bennington. As we know, this took place in the month of August. Well, this sort of set the stage for Saratoga. The New York militia had arrived at Saratoga. The Continental Army was under the command of a man named Nathaniel Greene, who was a very inefficient military commander. Benedict Arnold had arrived at Saratoga to reinforce the colonial forces that were there. John Stark and the New Hampshire, Massachusetts militia and Seth Warner and the Green Mountain Boys joined that force at Saratoga. And the battle began in October, and Nathaniel Greene showed his incompetence. The result was that it was decided that Benedict Arnold would take command of the American forces. And of course, after a 3-day battle, John Burgoyne surrendered. And he turned his sword over. He was going to turn it over to Benedict Arnold, but General Greene insisted, since he was the nominal commander, that he receive the sword of surrender. In those days, the losing general surrendered his sword to the winning general. Well, Burgoyne and his troops were paroled. I mean, they had no provision for prisoners of war at that time, and they were allowed to return to Canada. And Gentleman John Burgoyne, he was called Gentleman Johnny, went back to England. Now, for losing at Saratoga, of course, he was not a big hero. but he would redeem himself later on, commanding victorious British forces in the battle against the French for control of India, which the British won overall. Well, from Saratoga, of course, Benedict Arnold was rewarded by being named the commander at West Point. And the sad thing about Benedict Arnold, of course, was that someone who could have become great in American history became known as a traitor. Benedict Arnold had married the daughter of the British commander stationed in Rhode Island many years before. And unbeknown to him, his wife was a British spy. So although history doesn't record it, you kind of have to figure the thing that's going on. Apparently, she must have come out to him that she was a British spy, and she may have given him a choice. Come join us, or I divorce you. Well, it's pretty obvious that he loved his wife very, very much. But he made a very wrong decision when he decided to turn over West Point to the British. Well, of course, we know the story, how the go-between, who was a major in the British Army, was intercepted. His name was Major Andre. He was handling the negotiations between Benedict Arnold and his father-in-law for the turning over at West Point. And of course, he was caught and he was hanged. And Benedict Arnold, he escaped. And he made it safely to Rhode Island on a British ship, went over to England. He was given a commission in the British Army. But even in England, they didn't have much of a stomach for a man who was a traitor. And as it turned out, eventually, his wife divorced him anyway, and he died in disgrace in London. Died in poverty and in disgrace in London. Well, that is the story of Hubbardton. 243 years ago, history was made here in our county, our little county. In past years, of course, there have been reenactments of the Battle of Hubbardton, and it's drawn quite a crowd. Of course, this year with the coronavirus, things are entirely different. So we remember the Battle of Hubbardton, remember those that made the sacrifice there. There are a number of graves up there. Ironically, most of the graves that are there are British or Hessian. Colonel Francis, who was the American commander at the start of the Battle of Hubbardton, is buried up there. But a very, I think, interesting facet of American history. As you know, Saratoga was regarded as the turning point of the war. France decided, why not take a stand and come in on the side of the colonists? And their help was very, very important in the Americans winning the American Revolution, especially at the Battle of Yorktown, where Cornwallis surrendered, and for all facts, the war was over. So a very interesting fact of our American history. And as we look back on 244 years of American history, and even before colonial times, we've had our high points. Certainly Saratoga was a high point. Our American Revolution was a high point. And we've also had our low points. As we know right now, we're undergoing a transformation in America where we're re-looking at our history, and we're looking at the errors and the low points. But while we're doing that, we've also got to remember our high points too. Statues are coming down. Christopher Columbus is no longer the hero that everybody thought he was. Big statue of him in Baltimore was taken down and thrown in the ocean. There's even people that want to take down the statue of Thomas Jefferson, the author of our Declaration of Independence, because he was a slave owner. And that's something I'd like to talk about today. Thomas Jefferson was the author, of course, of the Declaration of Independence. And he wrote the Declaration of Independence while he was staying at a boarding house in Philadelphia in 1776. Thomas Jefferson brought with him a valet, one of his slaves, if you will, a man by the name of Robert Hemings. Now, Robert Hemings' father, and this was a rather unique thing, and I was reading about it the other day, and I said, wow, how do you figure all this out? Hemings' mother was African American, but his father was Thomas Jefferson's father-in-law. Thomas Jefferson's father-in-law. Robert Hemings, whether he had tried to escape at one time or what, he'd had his right hand shot off, or more than likely, as punishment when a slave escaped, they usually had something like a foot cut off or a hand cut off. But he was Thomas Jefferson's personal valet, and he went with him to Philadelphia and was there during that Second Continental Congress, which drew up the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson's wife and Robert Hemings were half brother, half sister. Okay, they both had the same daddy. Robert Hemings had a sister who was Sally Hemings. And as you know, Sally Hemings, after Jefferson was widowed, his wife died, he took up with Sally Hemings, who was working at Monticello, sort of doing housework and all that. And of course, Thomas Jefferson had a number of children by Sally Hemings, who was Robert Hemings' sister, who in turn, now let me get this straight. All right, Sally Hemings was also the daughter of Thomas Jefferson's father-in-law. So she was also the half-sister of Thomas Jefferson's wife. Now figure that one out. Well, the long story is that following the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia, Thomas Jefferson gave Robert Hemings his freedom. And he also freed 10 other of his slaves. But of course, he kept Sally Hemings for his own purposes, his wife having passed away. And it's not sure how many children he had by Sally Hemings. About the only time he left her, he left her in Virginia, was when he went on a diplomatic mission over to Paris to help negotiate the end of the American Revolution. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 ended British occupation of what had been the 13 colonies. Thomas Jefferson went there with John Adams to negotiate that treaty, along with Charles Pinckney. And he was gone for an extended amount of time, and he came back. And the other time he left her, of course, was when he was president. But from Washington to Monticello, they kept in touch. So Jefferson, of course, served 2 terms as president, and he would be succeeded by James Madison in 1809. So a very, very brief look at our history at that time. The anger at Thomas Jefferson, because he was a slaveholder. Maybe because of his relations with Sally Hemings. But as we know right now, there's a large movement to take down many of the statues, especially in what was the Confederacy, and also a move at the Department of Defense at some of these forts that were named after Confederate generals to change their name. And I think it's the right move, because after all, these Confederate generals were traitors. When they took an oath of office in the Union Army, they swore to defend and uphold the Constitution of the United States. When they didn't, and they went on the other side and they tried to defeat that Constitution, they became traitors. People like Robert E. Lee, James Longstreet, Joseph Johnston, Stonewall Jackson, and a number of these other Confederate generals. And I think it is right that their statues are being taken down, because after all, they were traitors. They sold out their country. And I think justice is being done in that case. With that, I'm going to wrap up today's show. May Almighty God continue to bless these United States of America. Take care of yourself. We're heading into a new era. God bless America. God bless you. We'll see you all next week.